For decades, organizations have invested heavily in improving the accuracy of their sales forecast. Entire software categories have emerged around pipeline management, predictive analytics, and revenue intelligence, each promising greater visibility into future performance. Salesforce alone has evolved from a customer relationship management platform into an increasingly sophisticated decision support system, capable of analyzing historical trends, identifying at-risk opportunities, and even generating AI-assisted forecasts. On paper, there's never been a better time to produce reliable sales predictions. Yet confidence in those predictions appear to be moving into the opposite direction. Recent industry research suggests that only around 1 in 3 revenue leaders generally trust the forecasts presented to them. Other studies paint an equally concerning picture, showing that fewer than a quarter of organizations consistently achieve what could be considered an accurate forecast. Those figures should give every executive pause. Forecasting is not simply another management report. It influences hiring decisions, investment priorities, production planning, cash flow management, and conversations with investors. When leadership begins to question the credibility of the forecast, uncertainty spreads far beyond the sales department. The natural response has been to look towards technology for answers. If forecasts are unreliable, then perhaps the CRM requires refining. Perhaps opportunity stages need tightening. Salespeople need to update records more consistently, or AI can identify patterns that humans continue to miss. The market has responded enthusiastically to these assumptions. Organizations are encouraged to improve pipeline hygiene, strengthen CRM discipline, implement revenue intelligence platforms, and invest in increasingly sophisticated forecasting tools. None of these recommendations are unreasonable. Clean data is preferable to poor data. Consistent processes usually outperform inconsistent ones, and modern analytics can reveal trends that would otherwise stay hidden. The difficulty is that these solutions all begin from the same premise, that inaccurate forecasting is fundamentally a data problem. Now, I would argue that this is where the conversation drifts away from reality. Poor forecasts are rarely created because Salesforce lacks information. They emerge because the information entering Salesforce has already been shaped by human judgment, organizational incentive, and behavioral adaptation. By the time a forecast reaches an executive dashboard, it represents the accumulated outcome of hundreds, sometimes thousands of individual decisions. Every opportunity has been assessed by a salesperson, interpreted by a manager, reviewed by a regional leader, and in many organizations, adjusted again before it reaches the boardroom. At every stage of the journey, people decide what to report, when to report it, and most importantly, how much of the truth feels safe to reveal. Seen from that angle, forecasting becomes something very different. Rather than a reporting exercise supported by technology, it becomes a reflection of organizational culture. The numbers inside Salesforce tell us as much about trust, incentive, and leadership as they do about customers or revenue. That distinction matters because it changes where leaders should direct their attention. If forecasting is primarily a reporting problem, investment should focus on better reporting. If it's the visible outcome of behavioral patterns established across the organization, dashboards alone can never solve this. They simply reflect decisions that have already been made somewhere else. Part of the reason this misunderstanding has persisted is that the language surrounding forecasting has become more technical than human. Browse almost any article on the subject and the same phrases appear. Pipeline hygiene, CRM discipline, forecast categories, stage definitions, revenue intelligence. These terms sound reassuringly objective, suggesting forecasting is largely a question of process and system design. Let's take pipeline hygiene. It implies that poor forecasts result from untidy data that simply needs cleaning. Opportunities updated more regularly, duplicate records removed, still pipeline eliminated. Few would disagree with those recommendations. But the phrase also carries an assumption that rarely gets challenged, that data has somehow become dirty through neglect. In reality, data doesn't deteriorate on its own. It deteriorates because people make conscious decisions about what they choose to record. That difference changes the nature of the problem entirely. If a salesperson repeatedly delays updating opportunities, the obvious explanation is a lack of discipline. But another explanation exists. Perhaps experience has taught them that updating opportunities too early exposes them to criticism if circumstances changes. When probabilities appear consistently inflated, it's tempting to conclude salespeople are simply unrealistic. An equal plausible explanation is that optimism has become culturally rewarded, while caution has become professionally risky. Most organizations ask why salespeople aren't updating Salesforce correctly. Far fewer ask why capable, experienced professionals might have perfectly rational reasons for behaving exactly as they do. That's the distinction that shifts responsibility away from software and towards organizational behavior. Salespeople interpret buying signals, assess customer intent, estimate commercial risk, and decide whether an opportunity has generally progressed. Managers review those assessments through the lens of their own experience. Regional leaders add another layer of interpretation, balancing commercial optimism against board expectations. By the time the executive team reviews the final forecast, the numbers represent a series of interconnected human opinions rather than a purely objective read of future revenue. Technology can organize those opinions remarkably well. It cannot make them objective. Optimism bias, for example, is almost inevitably in high-performing sales teams. The same qualities that make salespeople effective, the belief that obstacles can be overcome, relationships strengthened, negotiations rescued, also encourage them to see positive outcomes more readily than negative ones. A customer expressing interest can easily become interpreted as commitment. Within sales circles, this tendency has earned its own label, happy ears. Salespeople hear what they hope to hear, rather than what has actually been said. This rarely stems from dishonesty. It's optimism expressed through commercial judgment. But when hundreds of opportunities are shaped by that same optimism, the cumulative effect can distort the forecast without anyone deliberately manipulating a single record. Process may determine how opportunities move through Salesforce. Human psychology determines how people decide to move them. That distinction becomes even clearer with one of the oldest behaviors in sales management, sandbagging. Almost every experienced sales leader knows the term. Salespeople deliberately understating likely revenue or delaying committing opportunities until they feel almost certain a deal will close. Conventional wisdom treats this as a poor forecasting discipline. I think that explanation stops far too early. Sandbagging is rarely a technology problem. It's a behavioral adaptation to organizational incentives. Now imagine two organizations facing the same commercial reality. In both, a salesperson includes a significant opportunity in the quarterly forecast. The customer's procurement process slips, pushing the deal into the following quarter. The revenue outcome is identical in both organizations. However, the leadership response isn't. In the first organization, the salesperson is challenged publicly during the forecast review, their judgment questioned, their credibility quietly diminished. Although delay sat largely outside their control, the experience leaves a lasting impression. Forecasting confidently carries personal risk. In the second, the manager approaches differently, exploring why the deal moved, what early signs might have been missed, how future qualification could improve. The missed forecast is still taken seriously, but it becomes a coaching opportunity rather than a verdict. Both organizations experience exactly the same commercial outcome. Only one strengthened trust. Over time, each business builds a different relationship with uncertainty. In the first, salespeople learn that committing revenue too early can damage their reputation. So the rational response is caution, delaying commitments until success feels guaranteed. Forecast accuracy deteriorates, not because people are incapable of forecasting, but because the organization had taught them that caution is safer than honesty. In the second organization, uncertainty is treated as an inevitable part of selling rather than evidence of poor judgment. So risks surface earlier, coaching happens sooner, and leadership gets a more realistic view of the commercial landscape. Ironically, by becoming more accepting of uncertainty, that organization produces the more reliable forecast. Sandbagging isn't a forecasting failure. It's evidence that people have adapted perfectly to the environment leadership created. If protecting personal credibility becomes more important than flagging risk early, That's exactly the behavior the organization should expect to see. This is one of the reasons organizations so often describe forecasting as being more art than science. It usually meant as a harmless observation, but it reveals something more significant than it intends to. Forecasting becomes an art precisely because trust has been replaced by interpretation. Every layer of management applying its own judgment to compensate for perceived weakness elsewhere in the organization. The result isn't a more accurate forecast, it's simply a more complicated one. This also challenges an assumption that gets little scrutiny, that distrust flows only one way, from leadership down to sales team. In reality, sales teams frequently stop trusting leadership long before leadership starts trusting them. Consider what happens when executive teams inflate targets to satisfy the board. Or managers quietly adjust the numbers they receive because they assume every rep is being optimistic. At each level, people compensate for what they believe everyone else is doing. Salespeople become conservative because they expect management to raise the numbers anyway. Management discount opportunities because they assume optimism is already baked in. Senior leaders apply their own adjustment before presenting externally because they no longer believe the internal figures. Forecasting stops being an exercise in understanding reality and becomes an exercise in managing expectations. Each individual believes they're correcting someone else's bias. Collectively, the organization drifts further from an honest read of the market. The final forecast becomes a negotiated position rather than a general prediction. At this point, it's worth asking an uncomfortable question. If leadership doesn't trust information inside Salesforce, is Salesforce actually the problem? Now, in my experience, the answer is usually no. Salesforce has become remarkably good at recording information. Customer interactions, opportunity movement, activity levels, extraordinary visibility into commercial performance. But the platform can only record what people choose to give it. If opportunities are updated late, Salesforce reflects late updates. If stage definitions are interpreted differently by different teams, it records inconsistent progression. If coaching happens in notebooks, spreadsheets, or informal conversations rather than inside the platform, Salesforce has no way of capturing that knowledge. It simply mirrors the behavior taking place around it. A CRM system cannot establish psychological safety. It cannot remove fear from a forecast review or persuade a leader to respond more constructively when a deal slips. Those are leadership responsibilities. Salesforce merely makes the consequence of them visible. When leaders say they can't trust their CRM data, what they're often looking at isn't technology failure. It's an honest reflection of the culture that produced it. Replacing the mirror rarely changes the reflection. This is also why so many organizations invest heavily in forecasting technology without a corresponding rise in confidence. AI is the clearest example. Machine learning can identify patterns and surface risks that might otherwise stay hidden, but it cannot remove the behavioral distortions already embedded in the data it learns from. If history contains inflated probabilities, delayed updates, and widespread sandbagging, the model learns from exactly that. It may describe this distortion with remarkable sophistication. It cannot turn it into objective truth. Better analysis of poor inputs still produces unreliable outputs. That isn't an argument against AI, it's an argument against expecting technology to compensate indefinitely for organizational behavior. Leaders often hope a better algorithm will solve a problem that is fundamentally human. It rarely does. Organizations that forecast well rarely start by talking about forecasting at all. They build consistent qualification criteria, not for the sake of compliance, but because shared definitions reduce ambiguity. They train managers to coach rather than simply inspect pipeline reports. Above all, they separate uncertainty from incompetence. Recognize that selling has always involved things outside the salesperson controls, and that the objective isn't to eliminate uncertainty, but to service it as early as possible. As trust increases, people become more willing to share uncertainty honestly. As uncertainty becomes visible earlier, coaching improves. Better forecast becomes a consequence of that rather than the primary target. Forecasting accuracy is not created in the quarterly forecast meeting. By the time executives gather around the boardroom table, the quality of the forecast has already been determined by hundreds of conversations that took place over the preceding weeks. In one-to-one coaching sessions, pipeline reviews, and informal conversation between managers and their teams. It was shaped every time someone decided whether it felt safe to admit a deal was at risk. The executive dashboard simply reveals the outcome. That's why so many organizations remain disappointed when the forecasting initiatives. They keep searching for better dashboards when the real opportunity lies in better conversations. They invest in increasingly sophisticated technology while leaving the behavioral system feeding that technology largely unchanged. Salesforce has never been more capable of producing accurate forecasts, yet confidence in those forecasts continues to decline. The limited factor is no longer the software, it's the quality of the human relationships surrounding it. So the next time a sales forecast appears on the boardroom screen and somebody asks whether the numbers can be trusted, it may be worth resisting the instinct to examine the dashboard more closely and ask a different question instead. What have we thought our people is safe to tell us? That question reaches far beyond Salesforce, into organizational culture, management behavior, and leadership itself. Every company has a forecasting system, but very few recognize where it truly exists. It doesn't begin with opportunity stages or probability percentages. It begins with the environment leaders create every day, through the questions they ask, the behaviors they reward, and how they respond when reality proves uncomfortable. Long before a revenue figure appears on an executive dashboard, someone has already decided how much of the truth feels safe to share. That decision, not the CRM configuration, not the quality of the report, not the sophistication of the AI model, is what ultimately determines whether leadership trusts the forecast. Perhaps the future of forecasting will not belong to organizations with the smarter technology after all. Perhaps it will belong to those that build cultures where telling the truth is no longer the riskiest thing a salesperson can do.